Hey everyone, Dr. D here, and we have reached the end boss. That's right, Exam 5 review from Talaro's Foundations in Microbiology, 12th edition by Barry Chess. So let's go ahead and get started.
Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Explain stuff.
Yes, that's right. This is the last exam, Exam 5. This is not a cumulative exam. Instead, it only covers the last 3 chapters that we have gone over in lecture, chapters 23, 24, and 25. So let's get started with our review of chapter 23. Remember, chapter 23, we're talking about parasites of medical importance. You should know what the term parasitology refers to, the study of eukaryotic parasites. You should know that the protozoa are categorized based on their motility. Remember, there were the amoeboid ones, the ciliated ones, the flagellated ones, and then the ones that are called apicomplexans or non-motile ones. You should also know that many protozoa alternate between the motile and active trophozoite form and the smaller and non-motile dormant cyst form. Do you remember that we covered Entamoeba histolytica? You should know that this is the cause of amoebiasis. And amoebiasis causes dysentery, abdominal pain, fever, diarrhea, weight loss, and look at all that intestinal damage. And then do you remember that there were amoeba that can infect the brain? These are called brain-eating amoeba. You should know that these include Naegleria fowleri and Acanthamoeba, and you should know they cause PAM. PAM is primary acute meningoencephalitis. That stands for PAM. This is that brain damage that they cause once they get up your sinuses, travel up into the brain, and start feeding on that brain tissue. Next, we discussed Balantidium coli. And remember, this one elicits intestinal symptoms. And as always, please study these concept check questions. They may appear on the exam. So let's cover this one. Entamoeba histolytica primarily invades what? Remember, that was the small intestine. So we should know that for the exam. Next, we discussed the Trichomonas. Remember that these have 4 anterior flagella and an undulating membrane. They exist only in the trophozoite form. And Trichomonas vaginalis causes a common STD, trichomoniasis. And next, we discussed this really neat looking guy, Giardia. And we talked about how Giardia intestinalis is what causes giardiasis. You should know that this is a common disease among travelers. Remember, travelers' diarrhea, etc. And this is that one that looks really cute with the 2 little eyeballs, right? The nuclei that look like eyeballs. And it looks to me like a horseshoe crab. Next, we discussed these hemoflagellates, and you should know what each of these stages looks like. Remember the amastigote, promastigote, epimastigote, tripomastigote. You should know what each of these definitions are. So for instance, I might ask, which one of these is the form lacking a free flagellum, right? And so you would say amastigote, for instance. So we talked about those trypanosoma, right? And you should know which trypanosoma causes which disease. So for instance, Trypanosoma brucei causes African sleeping sickness. And remember, it's spread by the tsetse fly. Trypanosoma cruzi causes Chagas disease. And remember, that one's spread by the kissing beetle. And then we talked about Leishmania species and how they can cause leishmaniasis. You should know that this can be spread by the vector, the sandfly. And do you remember this concept check question? Hemoflagellates are transmitted by insect vectors, right? So we should know that for sure. Next, we talked about these non-motile apicomplexan parasites. Remember, a very important one we discussed first was the Plasmodium. You should know that Plasmodium causes malaria. And do you recall that it was the Plasmodium falciparum is the most malignant type? It has the highest death rate. So we might want to remember that. Because remember, there were several species of there were several species of Plasmodium causing malaria, and it's that Phalicarium that is the most virulent and dangerous one. And remember that malaria is an intracellular parasite that lives inside of your red blood cells. It's spread by the mosquito. Next, we discussed these alveolite parasites. Remember, we discussed Toxoplasma gondii and how it causes toxoplasmosis. You should know that this is the one that involves a cat in its life cycle. Remember, you get toxoplasmosis from scooping the litter box, right? This one involves a cat in its life cycle. And so remember, concept check number 5, a person can acquire toxoplasmosis from A, pseudocysts in raw meat, B, oocytes in the air, C, cleaning out a cat litter box, and remember this was all of the above D. Next, we discuss the worms. Remember the helminths? So one thing you should know is the difference between the roundworms, the nematodes, the flatworms. Remember the flatworms were the platyhelminthes, which includes the trematodes, which are the flukes, and the cestodes, which are the tapeworms. And do you remember the 4 different helminth life cycles? You should remember this for the exam. Cycle A, cycle B, cycle C, and cycle D. So for instance, I might ask you, which of the helminth life cycles involves a worm that develops in your intestines, where it releases eggs into the feces, and then those eggs are ingested by a new host. And then you would say, well, that's cycle A, right? So know all the different cycles and how they work, right? Because these are 4 very common. These are the 4 main life cycles of how worms infect people. Remember, we discussed Ascaris. Ascaris causes ascariasis. These are large worms that do not attach. We talked about pinworm or seatworm. Remember that humans become infected by the egg stage of the pinworm, and children are most at risk of this worm infection. Then we talked about hookworms. Remember, these are the ones that can burrow through the skin of the bare feet. Then we discussed trichinella. Remember, trichinella can be spread by eating contaminated bear or pig meat that's undercooked and ingesting those cysts. We also talked about Wuchereria bancrofti, which causes elephantitis, the guinea worm, which causes dracontiasis. We talked about the trematodes, which have a leaf-like body. A lot of them have flat, ovid, leaf-like bodies. We talked about schistosoma, which causes schistosomiasis. Remember, these schistosoma have a distinct male and female sex, with the long, slender female cradled within a groove on the wider, shorter male for mating. We also talked about Fasciola hepatica, which is the liver fluke. This is what the liver fluke looks like. Remember concept check number 9, the organism that causes elephantiasis has an enclosed digestive tract. Yes, that's true. And lastly, we talked about the cestodes, which are the tapeworms. We talked about 2 types. And can you beat Wicket? Which one was scarier? Which one did I say you would not want to ingest if you had a choice between Taenia saginata, the beef tapeworm, or Taenia solium, the pork tapeworm? Which one would you try to avoid? That's right, Wicket. As always, yeah, the pork tapeworm is the one you would want to avoid, Taenia solium. And that's because it can actually leave the intestinal tract and form cysts all around the body. Do you guys remember what that's called? You should know that that's called cysticercosis. You should know about cysticercosis, where eggs hatch in the intestine, releasing tapeworm larvae that migrate to all tissues and encyst. That's how you get those tapeworms in the brain and the lungs and all over the body, right? So we should know that the pork tapeworm is capable of doing that, not the beef tapeworm. And then lastly, we learned about arthropod vectors, mosquitoes, fleas, lice, ticks, These are pretty straightforward. And that really leads to the end of chapter 23. Not a whole lot of meaty material there to cover. So let's take our quick little break time with Gizmo and Wicket, see what they're up to, and then we'll come back strong for chapter 24. All right, welcome back from break time with Gizmo and Wicket. Let's carry on with chapter 24, talking about the DNA viruses that cause disease. Remember that viruses are not alive. I want you to remember also that chronic infections and latent infections with regard to viruses are not the same thing. Remember, chronic infections involve viruses that are detectable in tissue samples, multiplying at a slow rate all the time with mild or absent symptoms. Whereas latent infections, this is where the virus actually enters a completely dormant phase and is not detectable, right? It can recur, but it's not detectable. It's not actually making any virion at a slow rate. So these are not the same thing. And you should know that these are the outcomes of viral infection. Remember, you can have the cell lyse. Remember, lyse means break apart. The viruses can cause lysis. Viruses can cause a latent infection. Viruses can cause a chronic infection. And remember, viruses can even cause cancer. That's called transformation to malignancy. Viruses can cause cancer. They can cause transformation to malignancy. So all of these outcomes are possible, right, with a viral infection. And remember, we discussed both the enveloped and non-enveloped viruses here that have DNA genomes. We started with the pox viruses. Remember that pox viruses are some of the largest viruses with some really, really advanced structures here. And I want you to know, remember, smallpox was the only virus that we really discussed that's been completely eradicated. So smallpox has been completely eradicated. Polio is it's on its way to being eradicated, but it still, exists. And do you remember concept check number 1 here? Which of the following is not caused by a pox virus? And do you remember it was actually chickenpox, right? Chickenpox, which is a type of herpes virus. Next, we discussed the herpes viruses, and remember, many of these cause an infection, and then they go into latency, and then they recur, right? That's what they have in common. And you should know what each herpes virus does, right? Do you remember we talked about HSV1 or herpes simplex virus 1? It's the one that causes fever, blisters, and cold sores, right? And then there was HSV2 or herpes simplex virus 2. It was the one that caused genital herpes. And then we talked about varicella zoster virus or VZV. That was the one that causes chickenpox and shingles. And then we talked about Epstein-Barr. That was the one that caused mono or mononucleosis. Also, it could lead to Burkitt's lymphoma sometimes. Was cytomegalovirus, remember CMV, which infects the salivary glands and other viscera, resulting in those large cells with the owl eye inclusion in them. We talked about herpes viruses 6 and 7, which cause roseola. And then we talked about herpes virus 8, which cause Kaposi sarcoma. So please do know each of the different herpes simplex viruses and what they do. So again, concept check number 3, we should know this one. Herpes simplex virus 1 usually causes the fever, blisters, right? Or cold sores. And herpes simplex virus 2 causes genital herpes. So the answer should be A. And remember, with regard to varicella zoster virus, it's the same virus that causes both varicella, chickenpox, and zoster, shingles. And that leads us to concept check number 5. And remember, varicella and herpes zoster are caused by the same virus, right? And do you remember the hepatitis viruses, how they can interfere with the liver's function and the liver's ability to clear bilirubin, which is a yellow product that causes jaundice, right? Yellowing or yellow tinge in the skin and eyes. And I want you to remember that there are a bunch of different hepatitis viruses, but the only one with a DNA genome, right, was hepatitis B. Remember, hepatitis B was the DNA genome virus that causes hepatitis. All the other hepatitis viruses are RNA viruses. And then do you remember we talked about the adenoviruses? The adenoviruses can cause the common cold, right? In fact, we talked about two types of viruses that cause the common cold. Do you remember rhinoviruses and adenoviruses? You should make a note that those are the two classes of viruses that we discussed that cause the common cold. Remember, we also discussed human papillomavirus, or HPV for short. This one can cause warts as well as cervical cancer, right? It can progress to cervical cancer with certain strains of HPV. This is why that pap smear is so important during the gynecological visit. So this leads to concept check number 7. A patient complains of feeling tired and achy. You notice a pale rash on the chest, on the patient's chest, and a yellowish skin tone. That's the telltale sign right there. What is likely the infectious agent? Remember, yellowish skin tone that suggests problems with the liver, hepatitis B virus. And remember, lastly, we talked about parvoviruses and how B19 parvovirus can cause erythema infectiosum, or fifth disease. And that's it really for chapter 24. Let's take our final break time with Gizmo and Wicket and see what they're really up to. And then we'll be back for the final chapter, chapter 25, and wrap up this whole semester. What do you say? All right, welcome back from break time with Gizmo and Wicket, our final break time with Gizmo and Wicket. But we carry on. So, chapter 25, the RNA viruses that infect humans. Remember, we discussed a wide array of these different viruses. We started with the orthomyxoviruses. Remember, these were the influenza viruses. And you recall that there are three distinct types, A, B, and C. I want you to remember that type A causes the most infections and it's the most virulent. And do you remember influenza had 8 pieces of RNA as its genome? It has a segmented genome, so that was kind of interesting. Remember, it also used its hemagglutinin and neuraminidase in order to infect the cell. There were several subtypes of hemagglutinin and several subtypes of neuraminidase, and this is how viruses get their names, H3N1, H4N2. You should know the difference between antigenic drift and antigenic shift. So for instance, with the flu virus, antigenic drift gradually changes their amino acid composition due to constant mutations, single mutations. Whereas antigenic shift, remember, this was when entire RNA strands were substituted with strands from another flu virus. Remember, so like a few strands from a duck flu virus and a few strands from a human flu virus, they got intermingled, and now you have a whole new genetic makeup. And then do you recall that the Bunya viruses and the arena viruses were very scary zoonotically transmitted diseases, which can cause hemorrhaging and hemorrhagic fever? Remember hantavirus, how scary that one was? It spread by dried harvest mouse feces. And that led to concept check number 1. Which of these happens in the case of antigenic shift in influenza A? And remember, the answer was B, recombination of RNA segments between bird and human strains, right? So remember, it was this slide over here at the bottom that explains it nicely. The difference between antigenic shift and antigenic drift. Both play a role in how much the flu mutates and changes, but drift is less dangerous than shift. Remember, then we talked about these paramyxoviruses, and I told you that there's the mumps virus, the measles virus, the respiratory syncytia virus. What these have in common is they form a syncytia. Remember, a syncytia are adjacent cells that fuse together to form large multinucleate cells. Remember, we talked about mumps and how they cause the lumping around the salivary glands around the throat. We also talked about measles. And remember, measles can go, that starts with those Koplik's spots, and then it can culminate in a measles rash throughout the body with those raised bumps. We also talked about rabies, and remember, rabies is a slow, progressive zoonotic disease. You should know that rabies has a bullet shape, right? So these viruses have bullet shapes to them. And remember, with rabies, it's such a slow progressing disease that it's really one of the only viral diseases where you can take a post exposure immunization, and that includes both passive and active post exposure immunizations. Passive being from those immunoglobulins, active being from the vaccine itself, and you get those shots after you've been bit. So that leads to concept check number 3, for which disease are active and passive immunizations given simultaneously, even post-exposure, and that is rabies, right? Next, we talked about the coronaviruses, and one thing you should know about these is that they actually earned their name coronavirus. Remember, I told you it's because they have a crown-like structure, right? There's spikes, and how the spikes are distinctly spaced on the envelope. That's what looks like a crown. And so these viruses look like little crowns. And do you remember the different forms of coronaviruses that have caused human infections? SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome, MERS, Middle East respiratory syndrome, and most recently, SARS-CoV-2. This is COVID-19. And then do you remember we also talked about rubella, which is also known as German measles. And what I want you to know is this childhood vaccine here, MMR, stands for measles, mumps, and rubella. So this one mix vaccine regimen of MMR, this one shot covers measles, mumps, and rubella, aka German measles. And recall that rubella can affect both children and adults because as a child, if you catch rubella, this causes malaise, fever, sore throat, lymphadenopathy, rash, and it can last about 3 days. However, as an adult, you could pass it on to your child. This is known as congenital rubella, and then that could lead to really serious consequences in the child if passed on. Next, we talked about hepatitis C. Remember that this causes damage to the liver. Here it says that there is no treatment, no cure, but remember there is a recent development there. We talked about arboviruses. Remember, arboviruses are spread by arthropod vectors. And remember concept check number 5, rubella is a serious infection in both children and adults. And yes, we just discussed why. True. Next, we discussed human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, which can cause AIDS. You should know about the general structure of the HIV particle. Remember, we have 2 identical copies of the genome, which is a single-strand RNA genome. We also have, remember, reverse transcriptase enzymes as well as integrase enzymes. And do you remember on the surface, we have the important glycoproteins, glycoprotein 120, as well as glycoprotein 41. And you should know that these glycoproteins recognize specific receptors on your white blood cells, and you should know which ones, right? The main one is CD4 receptors, CD4, but the co-receptors as well, CCR5, as well as CXCR4. And you should know that the main target of HIV are those helper T cells, those CD4 positive helper T cells, which they end up destroying. And you should know that various cells are infected along the way. Remember, dendritic cells are infected, macrophages are infected, monocytes are infected, and it's those helper T cells, those CD4 positive helper T cells that are infected and ultimately destroyed. Those are the ones that get destroyed. All right, and that leads to concept check number 7. Which of the following cells is a target of HIV infection? And remember, we just discussed all of these: dendritic cells, monocytes, macrophages, helper T cells, all of these. But it's those helper T cells that get destroyed in the process. Next, we talked about the picornaviruses, and we mainly focused on the poliovirus and rhinovirus. So let's talk about those. Remember poliovirus? We talked about polio. Polio is nearly eradicated, but not completely eradicated. We should remember that. Polio virus is one of the smallest viruses. And what happens with polio is that it can lead to destruction of the motor neurons, right? Your motor neurons get destroyed, and this leads to paralysis, flaccid paralysis. So we should know that it's poliovirus that can lead to flaccid paralysis. And if it's bad enough, you could end up in one of these iron lung devices. And do you recall that polio is transmitted by the fecal oral route? So you become infected through ingestion, right? It's an enteric virus, which means it's a gut infecting virus. So concept check number 9, poliomyelitis is generally acquired through, remember, ingestion. It's a fecal oral route. And remember, we already talked about rhinoviruses. They are very much associated with the common cold. And do you remember it was the rhinoviruses and which other class of virus that caused the most common colds? That's right, Wicket, adenovirus. You should know that it's the adenoviruses and rhinoviruses which are responsible for the majority of the common cold infections. Next, we talked about reoviruses, which cause cold-like upper respiratory infections, and rotaviruses, which are oral fecal transmitted, and these can cause mortality and morbidity in infants due to diarrhea. And that is it. I just want to thank you all for joining me for this semester. I hope you learned a lot. Please stay in touch in the future. I hope that you succeed on your way to going on to either nursing school, dental hygiene, or any clinical programs you apply to. When you get accepted, shoot me an email. Tell me, hey, I got in. Don't forget about us professors, us little guys over here. Again, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the course, and I will catch you guys next time.
Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. A Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. A Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. A Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D.